Okay, let me verify. Yes, we're recording. Sorry about that, Sally. Go ahead.
No worries. Well, thank you. I thank you for inviting me and for setting up this webinar. And I thank everybody who's attending and the people who are still coming into the room. Yeah, so I'm gonna share a couple of things here. Suddenly now my slides won't progress. There we go. Okay. So there are two things I'm going to do. I'm going to give you sort of a historical background on the very diverse Muslim community that has made a home for itself in the metro area. And then I'm also going to talk about placemaking in Detroit, in Muslim Detroit. And so just sort of give you an introduction to what I mean by that, I have a couple of different models in mind. So when I refer to the Halal Metropolis, I'm referring to a city that is the word halal basically means it's like the Muslim word version of kosher. It's a place where things are sort of religiously sanctioned. So to refer to a space as a halal space means it's a place or a space that is explicitly marked as halal or Islamic. So this would be a mosque or perhaps a neighborhood when it comes to Dearborn or Hamtramck or a place like that. And then also thinking about sets of behaviors or praxis through which Muslims express their ethnic and religious identities. So, so for example, there are certain times of day when people go to prayer. And so in a walking city like Hamtramck, suddenly the sidewalks become alive with people, walking to the mosque. And then political relations through which local publics connect to others through Muslim identity or refuse to do so, because sometimes it's the outsiders who were imposing the Muslim identity on Muslim Americans. But we'll really sort of end with that idea because especially cities like Dearborn or Hamtramck or Dearborn Heights, increasingly in the present, they're really identified strongly with their Muslim populations. And I like the final definition I have here, which is by Henkel, who's a scholar who works in Turkey. And he's describing in a sort of Muslim majority environment by foregrounding Muslim elements and backgrounding other elements, by designating certain elements as significant and others as unimportant, life worlds that otherwise appear as heterogeneous can be experienced as Muslim. So I think this really gets to the experience of being a Muslim in a space where, whether you're the majority or the minority, sometimes that identity gets foregrounded, and at other times it's not the most important thing that you bring to a space or a room. And always this Muslim American identity is something that is highly diverse, it's highly contested, it's very fluid, and it's creating a moral community. So the backstory of this is, the first Muslims who came to Detroit and made a home for themselves in the city really were drawn to the city by Henry Ford and his $5 workday. Here we have the Highland Park factory. This picture was taken around 1914. And you see it's a very busy sidewalk. There were Arab American Muslims in the city of Detroit before the $5 workday. The Syrian community started arriving in Detroit in the 1890s. Many of the first immigrants were Christian. The Muslims were slightly later to migrate because they were in more remote parts of what is Lebanon or Syria today. And they started coming to Detroit because they heard about the economic success that their co-ethnics were having in the city. We also had in that early period a large number of Turkish immigrants. Some of them were ethnic Turks and some of them were Kurds. The Arabic speakers were referred to as Syrians at the time. There were Albanian Muslims and other Eastern European Muslims, people who resided in what was then the Ottoman Empire. And there was also a South Asian Muslim community that was arriving in Detroit through a couple of means. Some of them were people from the port areas like Bangladesh who came as merchant marines working for the British, and others. Henry Ford actually recruited Indians to come and work in his factories at one point because he had planned to set up factories in India and he wanted to train people to manage the factory. In the early 20th century, we also saw the beginning of the Great Migration, bringing African Americans to the city and other Southerners. And this community would really eventually join the Muslim migration. So this is just a number to give you an idea of how quickly the city was growing, both Highland Park and the city of Detroit between 1910 and 1920. The city of Detroit doubled, Highland Park grew exponentially. And then, of course, for the next decades, the city continued to grow really remarkably. So the immigrants who were coming here from the Muslim world were part of a much larger migration of Eastern European, Southern European, and other immigrants. The city of Detroit was about 35% foreign born in the year 1920. So this is a really large migration. And the Muslim immigrants didn't really stand out that much. They were just part of a larger wave of immigrants. Now, of course, we are aware that America in the 1910s became there was a big nativist movement. I think the percentage of foreign-born people in the country was making some Americans anxious, and we saw eventually in the 1920s we saw legislation that restricted immigration from overseas. But in the teens, Henry Ford and many of the other industrialists in the city of Detroit were very eager to promote these Americanization programs. And I include these pictures just to show what it was like. The picture on the left is a picture of the courtyard of that Highland Park factory with the $5 workday. So a lot of these Muslims who came to America, they were interested in several things. Many of them were really eager to Americanize a lot of the ethnic clubs that they created. If you look at the sort of their list of purposes of the organization, very often one of the main goals was to teach American values, to teach English language among their members. And there's also a question among scholars. I think a lot of people who study the history of Islam in America tend to look back at this period of the 1910s and 20s and 30s and see Muslims who were practicing in Islam in a way that is not necessarily the norm for how it's practiced today. And so there's a little bit of a judgment that they make on looking at some of these older institutions and arguing that there was sort of a de-Islamicization going on, that Americanization process was so intense that it was sort of robbing people of their religious practice. My work is sort of arguing against that, which you'll see, I think, in this talk. So when you're thinking about how do you create a religious community for yourself in a new environment, this is what you need. You need viable institutions. You need viable means of representing the faith to others, because in particular, Islam was something that was very misunderstood and misrepresented in the United States in the early 20th century. You also need a viable politics. As we'll see, many of the early Muslim immigrants were coming here from a world that was still in the throes of colonialism, and their politics, one of the things that brought them together was their anti-colonial ambition for their homelands. And then, of course, you need viable education. This is to promote your faith to the younger generation. And we'll see that the communities that were most successful at building mosques in this early period were the Arab American ones, because Arab Americans were allowed to come here as families. In the early 20th century, there were a series of racial prerequisite cases for people who were coming to America from outside of Europe. And the question was, in order for you to gain citizenship, you had to be considered a free white person. And so there was a question about whether people coming from Syria, Greater Syria, Arabic speakers, people, technically they were coming from Asia, whether they should be considered Asian and therefore excluded from naturalization, or whether they would be considered European. And so the Arab American community, the Syrian community at the time, went through the courts and they argued for whiteness, and they were granted whiteness. So this really distinguished them from some of the from the South Asian Muslim immigrants in the period. Certainly, the Turks were also granted citizenship, the right to naturalize. But the Turkish government, the Ottoman Empire, did not want Turks migrating, so it would only let men migrate. So their pattern was a very negative one. Was one that was male oriented. Let's put it that way. They didn't have families. So we saw very early in the 20th century, we saw a series of communities across America really working to try and create these institutions so that they could promote their faith, practice their faith, pass on their faith. And the first of these was a group called Khairat al-Ummah, which was established in both Detroit and Chicago in 1906. It was sort of like a mutual aid society, almost like the Red Cross, the Red Crescent Society, which we see also was created in 1916. The Khairat al-Ummah was an early version of that. In 1907, there was a mosque in New York City. It was a group called the American Mohammedan Society. They did meet for worship in New York. In 1914, in Highland Park and in Detroit, Muslim Americans got together and created a housing cooperative. They also purchased land for a graveyard in the city so that there would be a place to provide appropriate burials for Muslim Americans. In 1916, the Arabian American Society was created. That's the one that I mentioned that had the very strong Americanization agenda. Also in 1916, you saw the United Muslim Association organize. And I like to point out that if you're calling your organization United Muslim Association, that probably means that there's diversity in your community. In this case, the United Muslim Association was trying to bring together Muslim groups from the western part of New York, from Ohio, from Indiana, and from Illinois, with communities in Michigan. So they were trying to create sort of a larger umbrella organization. The Red Crescent Society was created out of World War II. The community in Detroit was trying to send relief packages and money and medicines and supplies to Turkey and to the coast of what is today Lebanon. And then there was an India Club in Detroit in 1922 as well, that opened in 1922, that was represented all the diversity that we see in the subcontinent, but definitely included a cohort of Muslims who interacted with the other Muslim Americans in the city. So what we had in the 1920s is we had some immigrants who were here, the Syrians in particular, who were on the path to citizenship. We had some migrants who were in Detroit who were excluded from citizenship. And then we also had native-born Americans who were excluded from the rights of full citizenship. And by this, I mean African Americans. So together, these people came together and built a mosque in Highland Park. This was 1 block away from Manchester, which is the street that the Highland Park factory was on. This is the mosque that they built. It opened on July 27, 1921. As you see in the picture, there are 3 religious leaders leading the congregation. The one on the left is a Shia imam from the south of Lebanon. His name was Khalil Bazi. The man in the middle was an Indian missionary. His name was Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. And the man on the right was the key principal organizer of the mosque. His name was Hussein Karub. He was a Sunni imam from basically the Bekaa Valley in what is today Lebanon. And they came together and built this mosque. Khalil Bazi arrived in Detroit in 1912. And when he got off the streetcar at Manchester, I have an oral history interview with him where he talks about, coming to America and not speaking English and not knowing where he was going. But here he arrived on Manchester and got off the streetcar, and he said, everyone was an Arab. They were all speaking Arabic. They were all from my village of Bintage Bale. So this indicates that there was a sizable community of Muslims that had come together around this factory already in 1912. And it was that community. There was a group of Sunni Muslims, there was a group of Shia Muslims, and then there were, like I said, there were a lot of Turks and South Asians who all collaborated to build this mosque. Now, the diversity that gave them the resources and perhaps the impetus for building the mosque also created tension in the community, in particular because Mufti Sadiq was an Ahmadi missionary. The Ahmadi are a group of South Asian Muslims who follow the teachings of a religious leader who came after the Prophet Muhammad. So for many other Muslims, he's considered a heretic. So the idea that Imam Karub accepted this religious scholar into his community before he understood what the man was teaching, honestly, sort of undermined his religious authority, and this mosque suffered. It's also true. Well, here I'll let you read this sentiment. Mufti Sadiq gave the sermon on the opening day of the mosque. He was the only one of the religious leaders at the time who spoke fluent English. This is why he gave the sermon. But I want to emphasize a couple of points here, the ones in bold. In particular, the religion of Islam treads underfoot all racial prejudices. And then also this emphasis on to be good citizens of America and to follow the laws of the land in which you find yourself. These sentiments repeat themselves over and over and over again in the early representations of Islam that we see from this period. And it's this idea of the religion of Islam being an anti-racist kind of religion that really contributed to the embrace of Islam by so many African Americans in this period. A lot of the churches in Detroit at the time were segregated churches. They would have some of the Catholic churches would have African Americans would be encouraged to attend the one service of the day that was offered to their congregation, and not encouraged to participate in sort of what became whites only services. Anyway, so here's Mufti Sadiq giving a talk at one of the halls in Detroit in 1921, and you can see, you can't quite make out from this representation of the photo, but the crowd here is a lot of Turks, a lot of South Asians, a lot of Arab Americans, and there are many African Americans in this audience. Mufti Sadiq came here as a missionary, and he found the greatest appreciation for his work among African Americans. And he started converting African Americans to Islam almost from the day he hit the ground. And he converted people on the ship over from India. He hit the ground running when he got to Detroit. So this is just an example of him sort of reaching out to a larger audience. So we also had in the 1920s, the man on the right, his name is Duz Muhammad Ali, who was a British subject, who he was a Pan-Africanist, Black nationalist kind of figure who organized a newspaper in England called the New Asia and Orient Review, which articulated an anti-colonial agenda that brought together people from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East under the umbrella of Islam. The sort of Islam could be the identity, the political identity, the religious identity that these communities could use to overthrow the British and French imperial projects in their homeland. And Marcus Garvey went to London and interned with Duz Ali and worked on his paper. And at the end of World War II, when Duz Ali's paper sort of ran out of gas, he came to New York and worked for Garvey and wrote for Garvey's a newspaper as well. So the two of them had a close affiliation. Duz was invited to Detroit by South Asian Muslims in the early 1920s, and he came to Detroit. And he's, when we think about the fact that the Nation of Islam was started in Detroit, a lot of people really looked Duz Ali as the person who, along with Mufti Sadiq, was sort of seeding an interest in Islam as an alternative to African American identity as it was experienced in that period. So the first mosque, as I mentioned, sort of struggled. A lot of the Arab Americans who were a part of that mosque, the Syrian community started moving to Dearborn almost as soon as the mosque opened, because Henry Ford started work on his Ford Rouge factory at the time. And that also sort of wounded that congregation. But in 1926 in Detroit, in the neighborhood of Black Bottom, which was the center of the African American community in Detroit, on Hastings Street, which is the main commercial street in Black Bottom, the second mosque that was opened in Michigan opened, the Universal Islamic Society. And this mosque was obviously, again, from the title, you can tell that it was universal. So it was trying to overcome some of the differences that had plagued the first mosque. And again, we see a very diverse audience here. That's Khalil Bazi, who's leading the prayer. Right behind him, we see Duz Ali. And in the small photograph on the right, you see Duz Ali and Khalil Bazi greeting each other on the Eid. So this was, just sort of promoted that idea of Islam as a universal religion, one that could appeal to people of all racial backgrounds. And it was in the period, just in the wake of the construction of this mosque, that Fard Muhammad came to Detroit and started proselytizing in the city. And he eventually met a woman named Clara Poole, who was the wife of Elijah Poole. Fard was a peddler. He was peddling women's lingerie in the city. He was a South Asian immigrant, most likely from the Caribbean. And while he was working in the African American community in Detroit, he was absolutely telling people about Islam and promoting Islam. Clara introduced him to her husband, Elijah, who became the sort of first acolyte of Fard Muhammad and changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad was the founder of the Nation of Islam. The two of them met in 1929. So the nation the date is, it started in 1929, 1930. Now there were a lot of political rivalries in what was happening in the early nation, and Elijah very quickly, Fard left town very quickly, and then Elijah also went to Chicago. But these various movements, like the Moorish Science Temple, the UNIA, and now here the NOI, really sort of created an atmosphere where the African American community was coming to know more about, identify with, and embrace the faith of Islam. Here's just a picture of some of the founders of the Nation of Islam that was taken in the 1960s. And because Detroit had such religious diversity, this slide is from the 1950s, but we had Albanian Muslims in Detroit, the Arabs, the South Asians, the African Americans, and we had some of the country's oldest and most established mosques. So in the 1950s, this organization, the Federation of Islamic Associations of the US and Canada, was organized. And Detroit very quickly became sort of the center, the hub of the Muslim community nationally. I like this picture of this banquet that was taken in Detroit in 1957, because you can really see the diversity of the audience that was on hand. When the group met in other cities, it was not as diverse, right? They were really working to bring the full ummah into their events in Detroit. So I said that people were moving to Dearborn starting in the 1920s. They came because they were working for Ford. This is a picture of the Ford Rouge factory that was taken. I don't have the year here. I think it's from 1923. And if you look on the right over here, there's a little neighborhood that was under construction here at the time. It's called the South End neighborhood. Dearborn really existed over here. The South End was very isolated from the rest of the city by this huge factory, and eventually by the freeways that were built and things like that. So it's very separate from the rest of the city. But the Syrian immigrants, this is where they made a home in this neighborhood that was like Highland Park had been, that was a very multi-ethnic neighborhood. In 1937, the Shia community built the building that you see on the right, the Progressive Arabian Hashmi Society. Sorry, they didn't build it. It was a bank that they purchased and turned into a mosque and a community center for themselves. And the building on the left was built in 1938 by the Sunni community. It became known as the American Muslim Society. This picture was taken in the 1950s when the group was doing a fundraiser to expand their mosque. But these two institutions, which existed side by side in Dearborn, they were just a few blocks away from one another. They supported each other over the years. If one group had a fundraiser, the others would participate. Occasionally, one would have a really strong Sunday school program, and all the kids would go to that, that house of worship for Sunday school, and then that one might peter out. People would go to the other one for a few years. So there was a lot of collaboration and a sense of that these differences, the Sunni and Shia difference in particular, aren't what really mattered in this period. So this was a period of, in the 30s and the 40s, this was a period where, if the immigration restrictions were put in place in the 1920s, then by the 1940s and 50s, you didn't see much new immigration coming in. And so it was a period of real rapid Americanization among the youth. In the late 40s, we had two religious leaders who were called to Detroit by their congregations. One was Imam Wahbi Ismail. He was an Albanian imam, and he was invited here by the Albanian congregation in town to lead them. He was a scholar trained at Al-Azhar University. His father was the Mufti of Albania. And in the period of the communist takeover of Albania, the religious leaders there were persecuted. Most of the mosques were closed. And so he was sort of like a fish out of water in a city like Detroit. But he was very influential in establishing the Albanian Muslim community here. And the man on the right is Muhammad Jawad Shiri, who was also a scholar. He had studied at the university in Najaf. He was a Shia scholar from the south of Lebanon, and he was invited by members of the Lebanese community to come. And so those early imams, Imam Karub and Imam Bazi, who had founded the first mosques in the city, they were not very well educated people. And as the younger generation of Arab Americans started graduating from high school and then going on to college, and serving in the US military and sort of entering the American mainstream, they wanted their religious leaders to look like other religious leaders in the city. And one of the older people I talked to in my research said that when he drove down Woodward Avenue in Detroit, sort of one of the main streets in Detroit, and he drove by the large Roman Catholic parishes and Presbyterian Gothic structures and things like that, that they wanted their community to have institutions that were, in the mainstream like those. And so part of the reason they invited Imam Shiri is because they hoped that he would bring that kind of success to their community. In the 1950s, this is the new structure that the American Muslim Society built. So they absolutely expanded their building and put a dome on top. It's an American kind of structure, right? But it was also signifying its Muslimness through its domes and its minarets. They very much wanted to sort of announce their presence on the landscape of Detroit. And so I mentioned that this is the South End neighborhood, and it was in its heyday. There was also housing in this area. An urban renewal campaign got rid of some of the housing, but you can see how separated that is from the rest of the city in Dearborn. But in the 1960s, we had, of course, the immigration laws changed again. And in 1965, and we saw new immigrants starting to come from the Middle East. And in particular, these new people who were coming were a little bit different from the earlier immigrants. Many of them were coming from Palestine. They had been displaced in the 1967 war or displaced in 1948. Many of them were coming from Yemen, which experienced a civil war in the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, when conflict started in Lebanon and the Lebanese civil war started, we had a very large influx of people from Lebanon. And so the Arab community started moving in that period in the late 1960s and 70s, and especially into the 80s, into this part of Dearborn, which I will refer to as East Dearborn. I came to town in the 1980s, and East Dearborn was majority Arab American. at the time. Now it's almost entirely. But you can also see in Dearborn, but just like this neighborhood is isolated from the rest of the city, there's this large zone in the middle of the city. This land was owned by the Fords. Henry Ford's estate was right here along the Rouge River. So there's this real separation between East Dearborn and West Dearborn. And in the recent period, Arab Americans have started moving into this area. So whenever in the 1960s, when Arabs started moving from this space into this one, um, uh, they were met with resistance. Let's put it that way. The new people who were coming to town at the time, they were refugees. They weren't necessarily the most educated people. They didn't necessarily speak English. They didn't necessarily have job skills. They had larger families than the average American family at the time. And so they were really met with a lot of resistance in the city of Dearborn. And this has continued. We can talk about that later. But so this is sort of flashing forward to the present. Now Dearborn has, the city itself has, I think, 14 mosques. But if you look at the area around Dearborn, the neighborhoods around it in Detroit, and in some of the surrounding suburbs, there are over 25 mosques. And there's just an incredible diversity. There's Sunni mosques, Shi'i mosques. There are mosques that are affiliated with, different communities, both religious communities and, sort of ethnic kinds of communities in the city. And the city of Dearborn today, its identity, its public identity really is shaped by the Arab American community there. These are just images of, the Walmart has Arabic speakers and people have their name tags with their names in Arabic. There's Arabic signage in some of the mainstream stores like Walmart. They have big halal food sections. The Shatila Bakery up here at the top is one of the city's most iconic institutions. Here's Ronnie Berry. His family was the first to open a halal butcher shop in the city of Dearborn. And this sign just, gives you an idea. There's supermarkets and cell phone companies and realtors and pharmacists. The city has very much of an Arab American identity. And, when we think about ways of making Muslim space, this is an example that I think is interesting. So the first mosque that was built in Highland Park, part of the problem that it had was that the community didn't know. It was their first time building an institution for themselves, and they didn't know how to do it. In Syria, where most of the immigrants had come from, very often some wealthy patron in the community would build a mosque, and often they would build something like a hotel next to the mosque, and the income from that hotel would be what the mosque was managed by, so it would pay for this. And that's what the Karubs tried to do. They had an apartment complex, and they were trying to use the income from the apartment complex to support the mosque itself, the construction of the mosque, the salary for the imam, things like that. And people in the community didn't understand what they were doing and didn't trust them. But if we fast forward to this century, the American Muslim Society, which is the mosque I showed you before, it's the oldest mosque in Michigan now. And it is still using this waqf mentality. They built this health clinic, which you see on the right, in 2005, 2006, and they're using the rent that they're receiving from building a health community in their low-income neighborhood, right? So they're providing medical services to the neighborhood, making sure there are doctors there who speak Arabic and understand the cultural needs of the community. And at the same time, they're able to support their mosque that way, so that the resources that the mosque brings in can go to supporting other types of programs. So it's just, so here's a map of the city of Dearborn itself. And this is sort of looking at the demographic shifts that have taken place. This space here is Dearborn Heights. It also has transformed from being 14% Arab American at the turn of the century to being over 40% Arab American today. This neighborhood, this is a Detroit neighborhood, Warrendale. You see that its demographics have changed. This neighborhood in Southwest Detroit has gone from 14% to 40%. So there are 9 mosques here in this neighborhood. And there are 3 in this one. So we're seeing the Arab community growing beyond Dearborn. We'll talk about that in a minute. And today, the demographics of Dearborn are over half Arab American. It's the first city in the country to have an Arab majority. And with this Arab majority comes political power. So the picture on the right is taken of the first city council that the city elected. Woo, I'm really running out of time. In 2012, that had to have an Arab American majority. And obviously, the city of Dearborn also has many detractors. People come to Dearborn to burn the Quran, or the picture on the right is of someone carrying the head of a pig around an ethnic festival that used to take place in Dearborn, assuming that Muslims would react as though it were kryptonite. That's not exactly what happened, but with this demographic power, we had Abdullah Hamid here. He's working. There was a flood in the city of Dearborn, and he was helping people clean out their basements. His volunteerism in this period sort of elevated him, and he was elected mayor of the city in 2022, and the first Arab American mayor in Dearborn. Historically, Arabs were excluded from public office in Dearborn because the city has citywide elections. It took them being the majority of the city to get an Arab American office. The people who were running for office from the Arab community in Metro Detroit and the Muslim community more generally tend to be left progressive Democrats, people like Abdullah Hamid and Rashida Tlaib, who represents Dearborn in Congress now. But in response to their success, we've also seen a movement in the community, sort of a more conservative move in the community. And this picture was taken a few years ago when the book banning controversy was sort of spreading nationwide. Moms for Liberty were spreading information about books that had LGBTQ themes in them that were being used in public schools nationwide. And this was sort of like a backlash in the city of Dearborn with people protesting the availability of these books in their community. And of course, this past year, with the war in Gaza, which is affecting the people in Dearborn very specifically, many of them have relatives in Gaza. There are people who've lost 50 family members. I met a woman the other day who'd lost over 100 family members. It's something that the community it's created a very large wedge between the Arab American community and the Democratic Party, as I'm sure you all know. And here's just a picture of Abdullah Hamid supporting the uncommitted movement, which was encouraging Arab Americans to not vote for Biden during the primary. And then later, of course, I'm sure you all realize that there was a big move away from voting for Harris in the presidential election as well. So Hamtramck is another city. It's a city located right next to Highland Park in the heart of Detroit. It's a small enclave city. I've got a whole thesis here about it used to be associated with the Polish American community. It has also transitioned in this century from being a Polish majority city to being a Muslim majority city. There's a lot of stuff that happens. They used to have Punchki Day, which is Fat Tuesday. And here a band called the Polish Muslims is playing in a bar. They have a Punchki run. And as you're running along the race, they give the contestants, instead of giving them water when they need a drink, they hand the runners beer. It's just very different kind of culture from the Muslim practice that's in place now. This is a sign on someone's business where instead of saying I'm out for lunch, it says I've gone to pray, I'll be back. It's become very associated with Muslims, conservative Muslims, religious praxis. Here's some of the first mosques in that area. Now there are over a dozen mosques in the area. And as you can see, they're very diverse: African-American, Bosnian, Bangladeshi, and Yemeni predominantly. Also very much known as a Muslim marketplace. I'll skip forward here. The city of Hamtramck also has gained national attention for first electing Muslims onto its city council, and now finally having a Muslim American mayor, Amr Ghalib, who is also part of this embrace of the right. So here he is. He endorsed Trump for president last year. Uh, and just to pick up with the African American community, so there were Sunni mosques that were established in Detroit. Masjid al-Mu'minin was the first one of these. It opened in the 1940s. It was founded by Hajj Samsan Abdallah. And I think that the Black Muslim community, the Sunni Muslim community, really felt under siege in this period by law enforcement. I think that they feel that their religious their identification with Islam was not necessarily recognized by other Muslim Americans. And so if you read this text, you can see that he's arguing that he's not a part of the Black Muslims, which were the Nation of Islam, not a part of a cult, not a, not a part of the Communist Party. So he's really having to assert a Muslim identity here in a way that a lot of the immigrant Muslims weren't asked to at the time. Yeah, this is just more of their material. And again, to go back to this slide that shows how these communities started really working together in the 1940s and 50s. And here's the Albanian mosque. Here's the first Shia mosque. This is the mosque that Imam Shiri built in the city of Detroit. Now it's a large Iraqi congregation. Here's them in the 1960s when that mosque opened. And again, the city, the Muslim establishment in the city of Detroit has been recognized as sort of the leading Muslim community. Here in the 1960s, the Muslim Student Association, this national organization, came and had one of their first banquets in the city of Detroit, and they were hosted by Masjid al-Mu'minin, the African American mosque, which sort of became a receiving station in the city for all the new immigrants who came in the 1960s, in particular the South Asian Muslims who started coming to Detroit to study at Wayne State University or the University of Michigan, and sort of created a new South Asian Muslim identity in the state. Today, the Indian population is the fastest growing foreign-born population in Michigan, and the Yemeni community is the largest foreign-born population in Wayne County, the county that Dearborn and Detroit are in. And I just want to say sort of one thing. So in the 1970s, when Elijah Muhammad died, his son, Warith Deen Muhammad, sort of led his community towards Sunni Islam. And so here we see a picture of Muhammad's Temple number 1, the Nation of Islam congregation, just before that transition took place. And then here they are a year later, right after that transition took place, right, where you see them becoming a part of the larger Sunni Ummah of the city. And so I have slides here. So just like in Dearborn, people are being creative and building all these Muslim spaces. The African-American community in Detroit is really investing in revitalizing the city, revitalizing the neighborhood around their mosques. And this Dream of Detroit project is sort of the example of this, where they're renovating properties, trying to get people to move back into the city. There's a free clinic there near the mosque, an urban garden. They're trying to put in halal shopping. They're trying to produce for their community the kind of halal space that exists in a city like Dearborn or Hamtramck. So I mean, I could go on about all these changes that are happening. We have new refugees coming into the city, first from Iraq and then from Syria. Now we have Afghani Muslims who've moved into the area. So the city is really changing. Its suburbs have become very Islamic as well. There are over 120 mosques in the metro area today. So I think I'll leave it at that and let you ask questions. Actually, my alarm went off and I started rushing, but now I see
You
that.
have a little time. I didn't want to distract you by saying, you can tell us more, but I can start us off with a question.
Okay.
As folks are putting their questions in the Q&A. You mentioned that there was kind of a renewed immigration in the 60s, and which of course was a really consequential time in the United States and in Detroit in particular, a lot of new leadership emerging in civil rights. And then, fast onto that, Detroit began its most difficult economic period, and a lot of depopulation, loss of jobs, etc. So as you were talking, I was wondering about that flexion point of those two things happening together. And I wonder if there's anything you would want to say about, how that ultimately defined the 60s and 70s and on into the 80s, for these new communities, for these new immigrants, what they encountered. Um,
Yeah. Um, so the city of Detroit, I showed slides that showed the growth of the city in the early part of the 20th century. But with the advances that came with the automobile, the city of Detroit was, we had the first freeway was built in Detroit. The first sort of even larger highway was built connecting the Ford Rouge plant to the River Run factory in Ypsilanti. The auto industry, I mean, the Ford Rouge factory was built in Dearborn. It was built outside the city of Detroit. They started construction on that factory in the teens, right? So the decentralization of the auto industry um, uh, was a part of it almost from the beginning, okay? And that decentralization, especially in the period of World War II, when so many factories were built in Macomb County and Oakland County to the north of the city of Detroit, started pulling people out of the city. And by the 1950s, the city's population had started to go down. But in the 1960s, of course, we had that period of urban uprisings around the country. And the uprising in Detroit in 1967 was one of the most violent, most dramatic. And it really decimated the city and made it very, a lot of people then left the city. The race of people to leave the city really picked up the pace after that period. And, Arab Americans were a part of that. The Albanian community built its new mosque in one of the suburbs to the east of the city. The Arabs were already in Dearborn, and they just sort of reinforced their investment in that Dearborn community in this period. A lot of the South Asian immigrants who started arriving in the 1960s that I had mentioned before, in the beginning, they lived in neighborhoods with African American Muslims and other immigrant Muslims, and they were, really working to try and build a community together. But once they graduated and got their professional degrees and got jobs, then they started moving into the suburbs, and they started building very grand mosques sort of on the very perimeter of the city, on the perimeter of the suburbs even. So this created a rift, in particular between the Black Muslim community and the immigrant communities. Um, I'm trying to think of what else to say there. So one of the things that inspired me to do this Halal Metropolis project was that I noticed, so the city of Detroit has been in a period of decline really until it went through bankruptcy and then kind of came out of the bankruptcy. And then the new mayor was really trying to jumpstart urban migration back to the city of Detroit. And I mean, that is succeeding among certain audiences. But in the year 2010, I was looking at the census figures for the city of Detroit, and I noticed that there were neighborhoods with population growth. And those neighborhoods were around Hamtramck, and they were around Dearborn. And the people who were moving into the city were immigrants from places like Yemen or Iraq or eventually Syria, people who didn't have enough resources to buy houses in Hamtramck or didn't have enough resources to buy houses in Dearborn, but wanted to live near those enclaves where there were mosques, where there were grocery stores, where there were people who spoke their language. And so these neighborhoods in the city of Detroit have become really vibrant, um, uh, Muslim spaces. And now what's interesting is that you see more African Americans moving into these spaces. It's like the racial segregation is breaking down a little bit as people share urban space. And this sense of Muslim community, it was also really enhanced after 9/11, when so much pressure was brought on the Muslim community when they were, treated as a threat by the federal government and by many in the media and many Arab, many Americans who were suspicious of the Muslim community. So this sort of compelled people to work together more than they had in the past. So, and it's still true that if you look at where growth is happening in the city of Detroit, it is happening in those areas that Major Duggan is making his real capital investments in, right? Billions of dollars are being spent in the downtown area and the midtown area and Corktown. by very wealthy entrepreneurs. So there are investments being put in those spaces, and new housing is coming in. Especially white middle class people are moving into those spaces. But beyond those spaces that are receiving all that official endorsement, it's Muslim immigrants who are choosing to live in the city from West Africa, from Afghanistan. And now, finally, the city has started to acknowledge the efforts and the campaigns of some of these community organizations and is working really closely with them. So, I mean, it's taken, maybe, I've noticed in the last maybe 7 or 8 years that this kind of relationship is being built more closely between city officials and some of the religious associations or ethnic associations that coincide with the mosques in the city of Detroit. So does that answer your question?
It does. And not only that, it answers a question I had refrained from asking, which was the interaction of Muslim communities with and Muslim people with Detroit's kind of governmental machine, I will say. Um, so, so that's very helpful. We have quiet folks, so I don't have other questions unless anyone wants to pop one into the chat now.
Well, one thing I'll say about
Mhm.
the question that you didn't ask. So Mayor Duggan, he was very proactive about hiring Arab Americans or Muslim Americans to be a part of his administration. So he
Mhm.
put in place, he sort of created a public health officer for the city of Detroit,
Mhm.
who is a man who ran for governor 6 years ago and did very well. He came in second in the primary in Michigan. His name was Abdul Sayed. He's an Arab American Muslim. And people thought it was sort of radical to see a Muslim running for office like that. Rashida Tlaib obviously is a congresswoman. She was first elected representing the city of Detroit, parts of Detroit. She was in the state legislature for many years before she was in Congress. She was the first Muslim woman in the state legislature. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the first Muslim American in the state legislature. The son of Imam Kurub ran representing Highland Park. So, I mean, these are just very minimal examples, but the community has been very active politically almost since the beginning, and the pace at which people are running for office and winning office has really picked up
Mhm.
in that post 9/11 period.
Mhm. Mhm. That's fascinating. I think my carry away impression is just the vast diversity, both sort of internationally and in belief systems in this one area in Dearborn, right? Like truly a microcosm. So
Yeah, is there a question there that's come in?
yes,
Oh, someone's
just
just
now.
thanking me.
Oh,
You're welcome, Megan.
thank you. We always take gratitude.
Yeah, I rushed there at the end, so I feel kind of bad about it.
Yeah, it's
Anyway,
good
it's
stuff.
okay.
I actually don't know what our typical practice is. We usually don't ask presenters to also like offer their slide deck. So it's all going to be there in the recording. And yeah, we just are so grateful to you for having taken the time to do this history with us and talk about how it's shaped Detroit and Dearborn now. We've learned a ton. There's one more, either a comment or a question.
It's a
Just another
comment from
thanks. A lot of gratitude coming your way from participants.
well,
So,
well, I will say I would encourage you while you're in Detroit to get out and explore a little bit.
mhm.
And there's so many different places that you can look in the city of Detroit if you're looking for the Muslim presence in the city. But obviously, the easiest places would be to go straight to Hamtramck or to go straight to Dearborn. And they are conveniently great places to also go for lunch or dinner.
Perfect.
That very Hamtramck is sort of like a food island in
Yeah.
a part of the city that is otherwise a food desert. And it's very, very popular. I don't know where the conference is going to be. Where is it going to be?
It is I'm blanking out just because I can't multitask very well, but
Is it downtown?
yeah, it's in the convention center.
Um,
The I can't
There,
believe I'm blanking out on this.
there's
Huntington Place. It's in Huntington Place.
Huntington Place. Yeah, there's a Sahara near there, I believe. Yeah, I mean there are plenty of places downtown. Just look, but Dearborn is the place to go if you really want to explore the more,
Yeah,
um, the greater diversity of the diet. But I would try Sahara downstairs. Just Google it. It's a small sort of takeout place, but it's got good food.
sounds amazing. Well, thank you again for your time today. We're so grateful to you. I'm going to pop off the recording, and we hope to see you again in some fashion
Well, I thank
in
everybody for
Detroit.
coming.